So, welcome to Study Chess with me. And this is going to be a continuation and the last part of blockading past pawns by Ludek Pachman in his epic trilogy on positional play. Um, so, the game today, or the first game in any case, is by Nimzowitsch against Georg Salwe. Um, the annotations I have here, because I gleaned the game directly from Mega Database, and I included, of course, the commentaries by Pachman because it's his book. But it also comes with the comments by Nimzowitsch himself. And the reason for this is because the game was actually one of the games featured in his epic work. I know I'm fond of the word. Um, My System. Now, My System is in many ways the godfather of chess strategy manuals, that and chess praxis. So it actually makes sense to use it because Bachman's trilogy, the complete chess strategy, divided into 3 volumes, and this is the second, is in many ways the successor, and a very successful one at that, published in the early 70s. And it presents all of the major themes: piece play, piece value, piece positioning, pawn play, which is actually the second volume, which we're covering now. And the last one is play on wings. Now, I own the book in French, and it's called La Stratégie Moderne. And yeah, I basically am using the translated notes from a PDF I managed to find on the book to avoid having to translate all of the notes that I have in the original French book. So, in any case, let's get to it. So we have e4, e6. Nimzowitsch, of course, is white. Well, of course. d4, e5. So this is the advanced variation of the French. As an e4 player, I'm very familiar with it. Bishop d3. Okay, so there's no comment here directly in the book, either by Nimzowitsch or by Ludek Pachman. But the bishop d3 is a well-known gambit variation. There are many ways to approach it. You can try to decline it. You can try to take it. Since this was played in 1911 by Aron Nimzowitsch, it's safe to say that neither he nor Salwe really knew the theory on it. I mean, they were basically creating it. Bishop d7. D takes c5. Okay, this is a really unorthodox way to play it. Usually at this point, you can play a6. You can just castle. There's no reason to worry about that pawn. The theory is very well developed 110 years later. Well, 111 actually. So yeah, I obviously have the benefit of knowing theory that's gone on for well over 100 years. So we'll just not make a bunch of comments on the opening because it's not actually the theme of this particular lesson by Pachman, but just worth mentioning. Okay. So he says better is a5, and I'm presuming that this was actually Nimzowitsch's comment. You cannot play knight g7 because of b4, winning the bishop. Okay, so. And suddenly, of course, the bishop here is gone. There's no way to escape. So f6. Now here the comment by Nimzowitsch is, Black hopes that after the exchange of the e5 pawn, he can free his pieces. Notably, of course, the bishop on d7, locked in a classic, this is a classic problem for both the Caro-Kann and the French defense. How to deal with that light-squared bishop, imprisoned by his pawns. White tries to hold the e5 point, and he occupies the center. b4, exclamation point. Now, Pachman has a comment of his own here, and he says that after queen e2, a dubious move, Black would play simply pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, knight f6. Yeah, it doesn't do a lot for to solve the the position, frankly. Okay, so before exclamation point, good strategy. Now, obviously, the bishop's going to have to come back to e7. Bishop f4, overprotection of e5. Now, the term overprotection was one that was coined by Nimzowitsch himself. And it's actually a fairly valid strategical point. I don't know the opinion on modern strategic theory today on this. But yeah, if you have an extremely important square, pawn, piece, or whatever, the idea of giving it extra power is, well, it's hard to dispute as a real problem. The only question really is whether you are not foregoing on more profitable strategic options. But since Pachman makes no comment, he doesn't seem to disagree here. So f takes e5, knight takes e5, takes, bishop takes. Nimzowitsch announces this is the new blockader, bishop e5, and it turns out to be an extremely tough character. So not bishop takes f6, trying to exchange the blockader. This would lead to queen h5 check, g6. Really? Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes g6, king e7, bishop takes f6. Yeah. The only question I have is g6 forced? I mean, I understand that it loses tactically, but is that really all you have? I mean, what about king f8 or king e7? Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this since it would detract from the actual purpose of this lesson, which is to instruct on blockading pawns, which he's doing, of course, with the bishop on e5. I'd really like to look closer at the tactics here. I mean, for example, let's just take a quick look. If instead of g6, which, okay, that's losing. That was pretty apparent. You can't really take on h7. It just looks really risky. So you take on h7, you have bishop e8, and yeah, you have a real problem here. Mostly because you can't defend the bishop. Okay, so if not bishop takes h7, and yes, king f8 isn't exactly an inviting move, but if it does the job, it does the job. And the thing is, now g6 is actually threatened. Well, so is actually bishop e8. Yeah, I'm not convinced, honestly. Maybe I'm missing something. It's very possible there's an obvious refutation that I'm overlooking here. An engine would certainly give the answer to this, but if you followed any of my previous sessions with this, you'll know that I am averse to using an engine, and particularly when I'm studying here. And the reason is simply that the goal here is for us to develop our own concepts, our own understanding of positional play. And if you spend your entire time looking at engines, I just think that it's counterproductive. There'll be plenty of opportunity to check with engines for other things. Right now, even if it leads to mistakes, I'd prefer to just use my brain. Anyway, doesn't matter. On to it. He played knight f6. Knight d2, and Nimzowitsch adds, the blockading force is to be reinforced by the knight. Okay. And there is a comment here by Nimzowitsch saying that queen c2 is a mistake because of castle. Bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, bishop takes h7 check, king h8, bishop g6, e5. By sacrificing a pawn, the h7 pawn, Black has succeeded in freeing his center pawn for e6, e5, and he has a powerful pawn center and very active pieces. And there's really no argument there. Black has a huge center. His bishops are now no longer imprisoned by the structure. So, yeah, and the h7 pawn isn't really a big factor. If anything, it might even help Black at some stage. But white is underdeveloped, and yeah, this really just looks pretty good for Black. Yeah. So knight d2, castle, knight f3, bishop d6. Okay, seeking to exchange the piece off of e5. And he does point out that bishop b5 would be a mistake, which would be a logical move because you're trying to exchange off the bad bishop for the good bishop. Bishop d4, queen a6, bishop takes b5, knight g5, winning a pawn. Okay. Now, bishop d4, there are comments here, so I'll definitely give them to you. Bishop d4 would be a tactical mistake because now Black can win the fight for the e5 pawn with queen c7, queen e2, knight g4, and we can already see that we have 1, 2, 3 pieces covering that e5 square. And yeah. More importantly, because you're attacking the h2 pawn now a bunch of times, either you give up that pawn or you allow Black to push e5. Problematic. So white would play h3, e5 immediately, and you've managed to free up your pieces. Nice. Very nice. Okay. So queen e2, rook a c8, bishop d4, queen c7, knight e5. Nimzowitsch here says, now the immobility of the blockade pawns is greater than ever. White occupies both central squares, the d4 and e5 square. So the question is, what can you do if you have won the control in the center? Because white now plays bishop e8. And the reason he's asking that question is that a lot of players, all of us really at some stage, will get to a point and you've managed to realize your goals. You know, my goal was to put my stuff on e5 and d5 and fixate those pawns on e6 and d5 so that they can't go anywhere. I've got my great pieces blockading them. Great. Now what? How do I proceed from here? What do I do? I know that when I was, well, let's just say less knowledgeable about the game, these were questions that tortured me. I mean, I would ask myself, okay, great. Grab the open file. Perfect. Now what? And you'll be fishing for moves because you just don't know what you're supposed to do after that. It's great to have goals, but sometimes after you've realized those goals, you're sort of left wondering, well, okay, and then? So white plays rook a e1. What is he doing is the question. Bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5, queen c6, bishop d4, bishop d7, queen c2. Starting to regroup, in order to follow the rule of thumb, exploit your advantage in the center to mount an attack on the wing. In this case, obviously, the king side. So what does black do? Well, black obviously has to take care of a few things, and notably the h7 pawn. And he decides to protect it tactically with rook f7. And the idea here is that this pawn is not actually hanging after the exchange. If white were to play, there are actually no notes here, but if white were to play bishop takes f6, you would take with the pawn, and suddenly you have two pieces protecting it against white's bishop and queen. So it would be fine. So white plays rook e3. Perfectly consistent. I managed with the idea of what we call the rook lift. Lift? I think it's the lift. I sometimes worry about those terms. Well, the idea here in any case, of course, is to bring the rook somewhere along the king side and add more pressure to the king side. b6, rook g3, king h8, bishop takes h7. Aha. And yeah, now the pawn is hanging because there's really nothing to be done. He points out that after knight takes h7, queen g6. And in case you're wondering why, okay, I was going to ask myself that question actually. Why not rook h3, which would seem to work? I mean, you've got two pieces attacking it, and this pawn is blocked because of the bishop here. There would be rook f5, g4, e5, and you have problems because of bishop takes e5. You can't take, of course, it's pinned because of the mates on h7. Queen g6. Oh, clever. With a pin of his own. Nice. Very nice. So to Salwe's credit, although he's losing, so I suppose it's only limited credit, but to Salwe's credit, he's presumably saw this. He did not play knight take h7. He played e5 immediately, trying to free himself of this little nightmare. And the double idea of e5 is that it prevents the rook from coming to h3. Bishop g6, rook e7, rook e1. Now pinning the pawn because of the rook on e7. Queen d6, bishop e3, d4, bishop g5, rook takes c3, pawn takes, rook takes, queen takes, king g8, a3, and yeah, this is the end. King f8, bishop h4, bishop e8, bishop f5, d4. And yeah, game over. Well, a very nice game by Nimzowitsch, who managed to illustrate his lesson to perfection. it probably didn't hurt that he had a weaker opponent who wasn't able to fight his ideas with the same level of skill as his illustrious opponent. This was actually a criticism that Nimzowitsch got a lot in his time when he published his book. They said that his games were absolutely illustrative of his concepts. Nobody disputed that. But that maybe his opponents weren't always the best opponents to try to fight these ideas of his. So his concepts always seem to come through extremely smoothly, with little resistance, almost as if these ideas were, let's say, impervious to such resistance. But maybe it had to do with, let's just say, lesser defensive skills. In any case, so the next game we have is now a position taken from Ciocaltea, I may have gotten that pronunciation completely wrong, against Darga in the 1972 Skopje Olympiad. And the comment is, White's main task is to blockade Black's c-pawn and d-pawn. Okay. The simplest way to achieve this is by bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, followed by c3 and queen d4. However, White chose a more complex maneuver. Bishop d4, bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, queen g6. So now he's threatening both queen c2 and bishop h3, of course, attacking g2. Black played rook e3, which at least successfully deflects from bishop h3, but it still leaves queen c2. Black took on c2. Knight c5. And he points out that Black's extra pawn is completely meaningless as White's pieces dominate the entire board. He now threatens both rook a e1 and rook g3. Black replied bishop f5, rook a e1, and a blunder on Black's part, a5. And he completely missed this, which, yeah, I'll just say it's forgivable. But Black lost his queen with rook 3e2, and suddenly the queen has nowhere to go. Oops. So the next game is, we're going to roll back the clocks over a century, well, again, but even more. We're going to be looking at a game between Schlechter and Janowski. Now, Schlechter was one of the top players of his time. He actually played a match for the World Championship against the great Emanuel Lasker. If memory serves, he drew this match. I will have to look up that the cross table for it. He was known for a while as the Great Draw Master, a title that's been held by several eminent grandmasters over the years. The last one, well, Leko had that reputation for a while, unfortunately. I think Giri did too, and more recently. Although he's now broken from it, and he's shown that he's perfectly capable of winning tournaments and not just drawing top grandmasters. But he always was capable of that. And I'm trying to remember. I think Ribley had that reputation for a while as well. I seem to recall that in the 80s. Particularly after he played one of the great GMA tournaments that was being held by the GMA Association. by Besselkock, and it was with the brainchild of Garry Kasparov. He brought in a number of elite grandmasters. There were something like 17 rounds or something, just huge events. And I think Ribley in one of those tournaments actually managed to draw every single one of his games. So this is the game. And it begins e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, castle, knight takes e4, d4, bishop e7, queen e2, d6, castle, rook e1, rook e8, question mark. Now these are comments by Pachman. So this is a serious error, which gives black a clear disadvantage. Instead, the right move was to play knight c5, with unquestionably the idea of knight e6. Okay, so mistake, queen c4, knight c5. So after knight g5, white already begins his blockading plan. If now knight e6, then knight takes e6, f takes e6, bishop f4. And the purpose, of course, here is to really just inhibit any attempts to play d6 or other. So this would be followed by rook a d1. And after black's next move involving exchange of two minor pieces, his important black squared bishop disappears, and this piece was needed to support the freeing advance of the queen pawn. So instead of this, he plays bishop takes g5, bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, queen takes c5, rook e6, queen d4, exclamation point. This is an important move which counters black's attempt to free his game. In the previous game by Janowski against Chigorin in London 1899, now, this wasn't written by Nimzowitsch in the 20s. These are comments by Ludek Pachman in the 1970s. And sure, that's 50 years ago. But even in the 70s, this game was well over 70 years old. So hats off to Pachman and and the depth of his research. So yeah, he had played. This was an improvement over rook a d1, f6, which was very good for black. And of course, part of the problem here is that the queen is pinned. So you cannot play this because you'll lose your queen. So queen d4, an improvement over the previous move. So bishop e7. And he's basically hoping for queen takes d7, c5, attacking g2, and giving himself a nice chance for a nice counterattack, since the rook here can easily come somewhere along the sixth rank and join into the fray of the attack. So yeah. But Schlechter may have drawn a lot of his top players like Emanuel Lasker, but this is Janowski, who's a very strong player. But Schlechter was no fool. So he doesn't go for that. He plays queen b4. Knight e4. So knight c5, rook e3, a5, queen d4. Now, the black position is now blockaded to such an extent by white's pawn on e5 and his advantageously posted pieces that there is no adequate way of developing black's queenside pieces, notably the rook on a8 and the bishop c8. White's task is now to open up the position on the king side so that he can attack the enemy king with his more active pieces. Not to mention better placed pieces. So rook b8, c4. h6, b3, king h7, rook d1, queen g5, rook g3, preventing anything on g2, queen f5, rook takes g6, f takes g6, h3, rook a8, a4. Now, the idea behind this, of course, is he wants to absolutely keep that bishop there imprisoned forever. And he's not interested in allowing him any kind of freeing sacrifices on a4 or anything, if that were indeed a possibility. With the bishop stuck here, it's basically out of play. It's not even a pawn, it's less than a pawn. Because pawns usually have sometimes a little minimum of value, protecting other pieces, whatever. And you can argue that it's protecting d7, but who cares about d7? So rook b8, rook d3, king h2, queen e7. And yeah, you may have noticed is that black is basically just shuffling his queen. I mean, let's call it as it is. Black has no moves, and he's just waiting for the coup de grace. Queen g5, it's not a threat. King h2. And the idea of king h2 is this is actually something that Kasparov used to champion. Right when he had built up this monster attacks in the 80s and 90s, just before he was about to launch the final onslaught, he would play some kind of small king move, a king h1 or a king h2 or something like that, or an h3. And it was basically just not so much as a precaution, but sort of a way of telling his opponent at the same time, you have nothing. So I can afford to just play this little move that will remove even that last final check of hope that you would wish you could give before I finish you off. f4, queen f7, e6. A very fine positional sacrifice which increased operational points for his pieces and begins the final attack on the king. Now, the thing to point out here is that you might be wondering, well, why is this such a big deal? Well, you have two things here. One, of course, is that you've actually opened up the d8 square for the queen or the rook. And as much as you've given away that pawn on that e-pawn, it actually doesn't do anything for black. Yes, there's a pawn, but it's the same prison for that bishop as before. The pawns and the squares, he's got nowhere to go. That bishop isn't going anywhere. And so we're not actually trying to get that pawn back at all. We're just trying to open up lines for our pieces so we can finish up off that king over here. So queen e5, blockading it. Queen e7, g4, rook b4. And again, these are just waiting moves. I mean, what's the rook going to do? Nothing. The rook can't do anything. King g3, rook b6, h4, queen f8, h5. This is brutal. I'm surprised Janowski didn't just give up. This must be really harsh. You're in a game where you can't do anything. And all you can do is sit there hoping that your opponent is going to basically throw himself off the balcony of his own volition. Because you can't do anything. You're just waiting for your opponent to set up this last attack and finish you off, or hope that for some reason whatsoever he gets distracted or overconfident, and gives it away for no reason. But yeah, that's a terrible position to be in. G takes h5, queen takes h5, rook b8, queen a5. Yep, no, you're not going to free up that pawn at all. Rook b6, g5, h5, g6 check, king takes, queen check, 7, queen takes. Yeah. Nasty. But okay. A brilliant game all the same by Carl Schlechter, who even in the year 1900 showed his mastery of being able to really just strangle his opponent to the point where he couldn't do anything and milk it for all it was worth. You notice that at no point did he sit there trying to jump the gun and grab a pawn or whatever, anything that might give black any dream of counter chances. No way. You just sit tight and wait for me to finish you off in my own good time. Really impressive performance by Schlechter. Okay, so that wraps up the last game and last position of blockaded passed pawns. And in the next chapter, which we'll present the next time, the third chapter of the book is called Special Kinds of Passed Pawn, which I have no idea what it's going to be, and we will discover together. In any case, thank you for joining me. Happy chess and good mates.